Tonight we have two authors in conversation. Mehran Sahami is the co-author of the best-selling System Error, Where Tech Went Wrong and How We Can Reboot. Prior to joining the Stanford faculty, he was a senior research scientist at Google. These days he's a professor in the School of Engineering, as well as a professor and associate chair in the computer science department at Stanford. Mike Trigg was on deck for the first tech boom in Silicon Valley in the mid-90s. He earned his MBA at UC Berkeley in 1998. Since then, his career in tech has taken him to a wide range of companies, from tiny startups to multinational corporations. He's been a founder, an executive, and an investor. Over 20 years, he's seen some projects succeed and many more fail, which is the Silicon Valley way. He's seen major changes take place and has documented many of them as a guest columnist for publications like TechCrunch, Entrepreneur, VentureBeat, and Fast Company magazines. BitFlip is his debut novel, and he's here to tell us about it. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So welcome everyone to this discussion of Mike's new novel, BitFlip. This is a pretty exciting event for all of us. We're really happy to have you join all of us. And I was going to give a brief introduction, but I think we just got the brief introduction. I will say that Mike is forgiven for going to Berkeley now that he's across the street. But what I'd really like to do is start off not only by congratulating Mike on the release of this book, which I think is just a fantastic read, because it weaves together a narrative, it weaves together a satire, it weaves together a thriller, and a morality play. So that's a pretty big challenge for someone to pull off, and I think Mike just pulled it off exceptionally well. So it's a brilliant piece of work, and maybe we could start off by just asking you, you've been in the tech industry for more than 20 years. What were the experiences that inspired you to write this book?
Well, there were a lot of them. I mean, 20 years is a long time. It was probably closer to 25 years if I'm not rounding down. And, as Alex mentioned in the introduction, like a lot of people in Silicon Valley have had, really fun, exciting, successful companies, really miserable, failing companies. I've been at a 2-person startup. I've been at a 20,000 person company. So I've kind of seen it and done it. And the idea for the book really kind of originated, like anyone, I'd get home and I'd share with my wife, Leslie, what happened in my day and just sort of funny anecdotes and stories. And she would sort of say, you should write a book. You should write a book. It's good stuff. And so I kind of ended up having a bunch of scraps of, sort of funny little anecdotes, but that doesn't really make a book. So I kind of worked on that for a while. Should we use that or? And then finally came up with the idea for the story concept. And as I got into actually writing it, it became more and more fictionalized, right? It became less, it never was really intended to be a memoir or autobiographical, but that was when it really got fun, was to create these characters that were kind of borrowing from people I knew and incidents I'd seen, but nothing derived directly from anybody in my life. So.
Sure. I mean, it takes a lot to go from a bunch of little anecdotes to a story.
Yeah. So
what was it for you that kind of pushed you to say, I want to actually turn this into something bigger?
Yeah, that was, and I'm going to take a moment to say there are a bunch of seats in front. I see people in the back. We're going to be here for an hour, folks. So get comfortable. I won't be offended if you're taking a seat. Plus, we're hopefully video recording this, so we don't want the front row to be empty. But what inspired me? There are so many great books, System Error chief among them, that are about Silicon Valley but are nonfiction, right? There's great biographies, there's great stories about companies. Some of my favorites, Bad Blood, by John Carreyrou, about Theranos. But when I looked at the fiction aisle, I just didn't see very many books that I thought sort of accurately and to some degree sort of fairly portrayed Silicon Valley. A lot of them felt a little bit too much like they were kind of glorifying or vilifying life here. And that was kind of where the inspiration originated from, is I thought, I want to write something that was true to my experiences and that people who worked in Silicon Valley can relate to. The title of the book, incidentally, BitFlip, refers to a change of heart. So in binary code, when a bit goes from a 0 to a 1 or back, that's called a bit flip. And the main character, Sam Hughes, kind of goes through that reassessment, that change of heart, and that was something that I was kind of going through at the time as well. So that got captured in the book too.
No, that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned Sam, who's the protagonist of the book, and early on in the book, you get introduced to him, and he's the COO of a startup. And he's being interviewed at a conference for entrepreneurs, and he sort of, somewhat unexpectedly to the audience, gives an unvarnished assessment of what he thinks the startup tech culture in the Valley is really like. So maybe you could give us a little reading from the book so you can get
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. So this was a fun section to write, and I probably should have brought my readers with me, to be totally honest, but if I stumble over a word or two here, it's because of my eyesight. But in my career in tech, I was in this position quite often of speaking at conferences. There are a lot of conferences in the tech world, and there's definitely sort of a whole rhetoric to those events, the way you're supposed to talk, and kind of the humble brags that you put in about your company. And I sort of thought, what if somebody just kind of lost it and sort of spoke truth on stage? And so this is Sam. He's at a conference, a real conference called SaaStr. I don't think the SaaStr people know that I referenced them in here yet. But,
they will soon.
They will soon, as this goes bestseller. So Sam is sort of having that moment. He's reflecting on his career. Sam clasped his hands, cleared his throat, and leaned forward in his chair. Maybe I've just been here too long and gotten a little cynical, but we're all fed this narrative about success when we come to Silicon Valley. I remember sitting out there in the audience and watching people like us talk. We use the language of humility and virtue and modesty, but really we're all just bragging. We remember how envious we felt about those lucky ones who raised big rounds or had successful exits. So now we want you to feel that same envy, that jealousy, to hold us in high esteem for our amazing accomplishments. That's the fuel that keeps the Valley going. Greed and envy and pride and all the other deadly sins are the core flywheel of who we are. We may sugarcoat it in rhetoric about making the world a better place, but for the most part, that's bullshit. Sorry to kill all the children in the audience. We're motivated by fame and fortune just like everyone else, more so than everyone else. Without your naive optimism, your willingness to take the riskiest 1 in a million bets, Silicon Valley doesn't exist. The machine stalls. The story you're told by entitled entrepreneurs and your friends at other companies and investors and the tech press is just that, a story. Ostensibly to inspire you, but in reality, it entraps you. Destines you to expend your energy and creativity for the enrichment of investors. Measures you only by the size of your exits. Values you only by the esteem of others. Don't let yourself be a victim of that one narrative. On there. So that was Sam's meltdown moment, it's kind of the triggering event for the action in the story. He ends up losing his job over that little rant, and things go from there. So
yeah, and it goes very nicely from there. I have to say, I can't say enough nice things about this book.
But there's an interesting little anecdote I'll share about that opening. That was the original ending of the book, and Sam sort of came to that realization or rejection at some level of the tech industry at the end. And working with my developmental editor, we thought it would actually be much more interesting for Sam's character development to sort of start with that sentiment and to see sort of how his personality will evolve from there. So.
Well, part of that personality is that evolution is how in the book you're also weaving through a characterization of Silicon Valley's tech industry as sort of being in an identity crisis, paralleling Sam having an identity crisis. So what do you mean by that? What do you mean by the Valley being in an identity crisis?
Well, it's obviously borrowing that term from psychology of somebody sort of not knowing, sort of losing their compass, if you will, not knowing, what's important to you, et cetera. And I wrote this book. Well, I started it well before COVID happened. I think COVID and more recently, frankly, the downturn in the market, especially for tech companies, has really exacerbated sentiments that a lot of people in the tech industry, I think, had for a long time. That the point that Sam makes in that excerpt that I just read, that I felt in 1996 when I moved to Silicon Valley. It's like, we're going to make the world a better place and make a shitload of money. That was kind of the tacit, you can have it all feeling that I think a lot of people in tech had. And boy, when you see, I think it really started to tip around 2016, right, with the Cambridge Analytica stuff and the recognition of how Facebook and some of these other large technology platforms weren't necessarily making the world a better place. In fact, in some very pronounced ways, they were making the world a worse place. And so for a lot of people, I think in big tech companies and technology companies at any level, that's forced a little bit of a reckoning and a reassessment of like, wait a minute, why am I doing this? Is it just about the money? And frankly, for most companies, that windfall payday, it never happens. So I think we've seen this sort of play out. A lot of the city of San Francisco's population has declined by 7%. Some demographic groups, kids, people in their 20s to 35, now to me, kids, but that segment has lost 25% of the population in that segment has left the city of San Francisco. So there's some really clear indicators that people are reassessing, is this important to me? And what did I make the right career choice?
Well, it seems like that's spoken from the heart. So we've known each other for over 20 years.
We should have started with that.
Let's get a little more personal. And all of you, or the vast majority of you, I think, know Mike pretty well. So why don't we, take it down a level? And did you have a similar change of heart? Is that part of the reason why you wrote this?
100%. Yeah. I mean, I don't, again, for me, it wasn't an outright rejection of the tech industry. I think the technology industry has been, the most critical economic transformation of our lifetime, certainly. I mean, you don't have to be a historian to know that this rivals sort of the industrial era, the information era that we've been in. Our lives have all vastly improved, and your book really nails this, perfectly. We have to be mindful of where there are negative consequences. And I had moments in my career where you sort of step back and you're like, hey, I'm obsessing over where to put this button on this website to get people to click more, and to get them to view more, and to get them to stay on the site more, and to be more addicted to our product, and it can be you can very much abstract that out when you're at a technology company towards the objective, and sort of lose sight of the fact that objective is, commercial in nature at best, and in some cases cannot necessarily have the best interests of users or customers in mind as well. So I think we're well into an era where, big tech companies really, in some respects, have almost transcended governments in terms of their power and influence in the world. And so that can be a little bit scary. But anyway, back to my personal journey. Yeah, I think some of those thoughts were sort of brewing for me. And then, COVID happened. So I was trying to write this during nights and weekends as I was doing another technology startup. That wasn't going super well because, it's hard to do, and you have two kids and everything else. And so for me, COVID was kind of a silver lining, of which was to say, hey, if I'm, gonna pursue this dream I've always had to write a novel, now's the time to do it. I'm already working from home anyway, and not leaving a job, so I'll jump into it. And I am so glad I did, because doing that afforded me the chance to get the book finished, get it published. My second book is in the works, and I'm having a blast.
That's fantastic. We'll get to sort of futures in just a second. But I want to drive into one of the things you just mentioned, where you were talking about the notion of big tech platforms and their relative power versus governments. And there's this quote by the historian Yuval Harari, wrote *Sapiens: 21 Lessons for the 21st Century*, some of you may have known, that, to paraphrase what he says, is basically what Google and Facebook do is more consequential than what the governments of France and Germany do on a geopolitical level in terms of the number of people that are actually impacted. And some of those companies had particular mottos, like in the early days, Google has a motto.
Don't be evil, right?
Exactly. Do you think they're being evil now?
You know, I think, you know, I've been on both sides, right? I've been a consumer and a user of these platforms, and I've been a builder of these platforms. Probably the most notable consumer site that I worked on was a company called Hi-Fi. That was a big consumer internet site, one of the top 20 websites in the world back in the day. And you know, I think I always am sort of careful about this, and I try to be thoughtful in my book and my blog posts that, you know, I don't see a lot of nefarious bad actors in Silicon Valley. You know, I don't see a lot of people who are sort of deliberately trying to manipulate, you know, people. And I think actually credit to the Google founders for having the foresight to recognize, you know, and encapsulate and don't be evil. Like, it's easy to be evil when you're at that scale, right? It's easy to exploit the market power that those platforms have towards their financial gain. I'll give you a little example in my current life. On the other side, you know, I use Facebook to publicize my stuff. I use a lot of different social platforms. Facebook, I can tell right behind the scenes, has been dialing back how many people see my posts. Why do they do that? Because they want me to pay to get people to see my posts, right? So those are the kinds of things that I think when you're in the bowels of an organization and you've got your KPIs to hit, you know, you sort of lose sight of that. But those things kind of feel a little, you know, maybe not evil, but manipulative. I think, not to pick on Facebook, but the revelations, having two teenage sons, revelations around Facebook's, you know, knowledge internally and within their organization, Facebook Files as they're called, of the addictive and detrimental mental health aspects of their Instagram platform, especially for young women. You know, damn. You read about stuff like that and you just go, okay, we've lost something here. We've lost a little bit of a moral compass. And, you know, but again, I think often, for the most part, to the credit of the people in those organizations, there is reckoning in all those organizations. Your former company, Google, you know, employees aren't afraid in those companies to raise their hand and say, hey, I'm not comfortable with what's going on here. And so I do think that there's a recognition, maybe unique within the tech industry, of the responsibility and that we have, and you know, generally a desire to do the right thing. I think what can really cloud people's judgment, and this is again a bit of the moral of the story of BitFlip, is, you know, when giant dump trucks full of money are backed up, you know, it can be really easy to talk about your ethics when there isn't a huge windfall on the line, but harder when when that is the potential outcome. So.
No, that's very true. There's an interesting story about YouTube, for example, where when you talk about KPIs, key performance indicators, and Google, they call them OKRs, same kind of a concept, but that they were measuring how successful the platform was. The whole goal was to increase the number of minutes of total watch time that people had, and their goal was to achieve over 1 billion hours actually of watch time within a month. And that's an interesting goal until you think about how much time, like your kids, my kids, are actually spending in front of the screen, whether or not that's the outcome you really want.
Yeah, and there's even a next order of nuance to this, which is that human beings have awful base behaviors oftentimes, right? I mean, that's kind of the YouTube example is a great one where you can sort of look at that from the outside and say, oh gosh, can you believe YouTube? Like, they're feeding people these, you know, extreme videos to get them hooked and everything else. It's like, yeah, but people are watching those videos too, right? I mean, and that's, and when you're on the other side as a business, you can see the analytics and you can see, hey, if we serve up, you know, this terrible video, this person's gonna watch it and we're gonna get more view time and everything else. And so I think you can't just have, obviously, the guiding principle of, you know, a single KPI or a goal of, you know, making money as a business. I think when you get to that scale, you really need to take other factors into account and say, you know, okay, what is this doing? I will say, you know, borrowing from Leslie's experience in the medical device world, you know, in that world there's the FDA, and you have to run clinical trials. In the tech world, experiments are done on us. They're done on our children. You know, that's the honest truth, right? Like, every site out there is running thousands of A/B tests to figure out what's going to keep you hooked, what's going to, get you to click, etc. And I wouldn't want the tech industry to be as heavily regulated as the healthcare industry, but I think there's a merit to saying you need to run a clinical trial on this new Instagram algorithm or whatever it might be. You need to run an experiment with X thousand people, and you need to submit those results to a governmental body who will review them and make sure you're not unleashing something truly terrible on the public. Because I'll pick on TikTok just to pick another company. And there's just so much, and yet people are hooked, and kids especially are hooked. So
Yeah, just to cite one study, and then we'll change gears. Facebook did do a study. You mentioned that they should be doing studies. Maybe there should actually be a governmental board providing oversight, because they did actually do a study a few years ago to determine how much they could change your emotional state based on what they showed you in your feed, and they actually found that they can do a pretty good job doing that.
yeah.
Which is kind of frightening, but it was just for their own edification and to publish a paper. It seems like maybe there's better things to publish papers on, but there was no governmental body to actually say, maybe this is not the kind of thing
We should be doing, right.
So maybe to follow up on that, if you could change the credo of the tech industry, right, to something else, you have your magic wand, what would you want to change?
Oh man, that's a hard one. I mean, I don't know if I'll be able to capture it in a credo just off the top of my head, but the kind of original statement of make the world a better place, I think it's easy to sort of feel cynical about that now, and Sam sort of has that moment. Your book opens with a similar line of make the world a better place, feels more like a punchline for very shallow mission statements at a lot of companies. But if you really rewind your brain to the start of the internet and as some of these platforms were growing, technology has made the world a better place in many, many ways. I mean, I probably couldn't have gotten here today if it weren't for Google Maps, right? I mean, it's hard to sort of imagine an era before cell phones and internet and all those things that have made life better for millions and millions of people, and with relatively few consequences compared to industrial era, gas and oil. I mean, there are other industries that have plenty to answer for. So I think that principle is still relevant, but we need to sort of reinvigorate it and make it not just sort of boilerplate language in HR folders and CEO manifestos. I think good companies, smart companies, and given the power that some of these big tech companies have, they really need to resurrect those core values and live them. And I think, again, to keep referencing your book, there's so many great ideas in System Error, which I really encourage everybody to read, that bring sort of pragmatic ideas to the fold in terms of how that can happen. I think I mentioned a lot of big tech companies have active employee bodies, and I think having sort of the ability to kind of whistleblow within organizations is an important one. I think we're far past the time that there should be regulatory oversight, more regulatory oversight, even though having formerly been in government, I know that's really hard, and there's some negatives to that as well. But let's actually try to make the world a better place again. I think that'd be my credo.
Fantastic. Well, thinking about how companies sometimes justify to themselves that they're making the world a better place, and they begin to take kind of steps towards stretching the truth sometimes, and that crosses over into in some cases outright fraud, like we saw with Theranos.
Yeah.
There's that mantra of fake it till you make it, right? And I think that's one of the things that in the book is one of the themes. Becomes an important part of the storyline. Really, like when you get into the thriller aspect of it, there's if you can believe that, like all this stuff gets woven through. You've got to check it out. What do you think of that? The dangers of that mindset, the fake it till you make it.
I really wanted the book to be sort of a slippery slope. I know a lot of stuff in the kind of the thriller genre has that like the dramatic reveal where everything's different now. And A, I didn't think that was realistic for a corporate thriller, but B, that's kind of the journey that a lot of people go on within these organizations. It's like, oh gosh, this doesn't feel so good, but let's correct it. Let's manage it. Let's not divulge that. Let's keep going, keep going, keep going. And you can get into this really kind of scary justification, rationalization loop where you sort of step back and you're like, wait, where are we now? Like, we got way far afield from, a decision that I would have made at the start. And that's, kind of the journey that Sam goes on. He suspects maybe something weird, fishy's going on, and as he learns more about it, he starts to realize, well, I could blow this up, but then I also have a financial incentive to kind of go along with it and make sure that we all reach a successful outcome. So he's always kind of trying to thread this needle between his kind of Midwestern, wholesome values and like his desire to be a successful entrepreneur. And so that's, that really was, I think the core of the story at some level is how do you wrestle with that? How do you maintain your moral compass, even when there might be things in your professional incentives and personal incentives that are steering you in a different direction?
And you mentioned Midwestern values. I mean, you can't help but see some parallels there, right? You were born in Kentucky, you grew up in Wisconsin. When I was reading the story, I always keep that in mind. There's a part in the book where Sam actually goes back to his hometown. So how much of Sam is you?
Well, there are certainly some similarities. My original character name for him was Mark. And that just felt a little too close. I think, especially as a first-time novelist, it's easy to write from your own voice, and so I think a lot of the initial storyline felt sort of closer to me. There's certainly aspects of his age, his role, his Midwestern upbringing that are parallel to mine. But again, as I got more and more into it, I got became more and more distanced from Sam, if you will. But I think his Midwesternness is an important part of who he is, and there's a sequence in the book where he's sort of jobless and rudderless and reassessing what's important to him, and he goes back to Ohio, where he's from. I'm actually going to be going back to Ohio myself pretty soon, which is going to be great, doing a book event there. But you sort of see the origins of a lot of these motivations that he has that he almost doesn't even realize he has. There's a struggling family business that he's always felt sort of guilty about not taking it over from his father, and he sort of has this heart-wrenching moment with his father where he's like, my happiest day was when you got the hell out of this town. So there's a lot of complexity and nuance to that that I wanted to capture. I picked Ohio because at the time, I grew up in mostly Wisconsin. I'm born in Kentucky, very short period of time there. My dad was from Michigan, my mom was from Minnesota, went to school in Illinois, so I kind of picked the last remaining Midwestern state that I didn't have like a direct tie to, and then of course my son ends up going to college in Ohio, so go figure.
Well, so in addition to sort of the hometown values, that aspect of the story, there's obviously a lot of vignettes that are in the story that are based on other things that happen in Silicon Valley. Some of them historical, some of them seem like, like you were mentioning at the very beginning, there's these stories you were telling your wife. How much of the things that you pulled in are actual experiences that you saw are pretty close to what you saw, and how did you think about what were the nuggets that you wanted to pull out? What were the real issues you wanted to elevate there?
I mean, there were definitely, we've all had these moments where you're at work or you're in a meeting or you're at a social function or whatever, and you're like, I can't believe I just heard that, right? And so a handful of those things were captured, but I really, I wasn't trying to write a memoir, as I mentioned, and so I would sort of take those things that seemed particularly either humorous oftentimes or kind of sad or heartbreaking or whatever, but I didn't put them all into necessarily a single character, right? So I created what I describe as composite characters, where I said, okay, the character I'll mention. So there's a character in here called Peter Green, who is somebody Sam worked for early in his career, who's gone on to be this multi-billionaire, eccentric guy. not that any of us know any people like that. And so, you know, I do know people like that, as we all do, right? But, you know, I sort of borrowed from people I've met, people I know, but also people I don't know, right? There's a little bit of like Elon Musk-y type feel in there, and people you read about and things like that. So it was fun to kind of create these characters who are composites, and I think as people who've read the book will say like, oh gosh, you know, I worked with somebody just like that or whatever, or is that based on so-and-so? And it's like, no, they're not. They're truly fictional characters, but I think that the fact that there's little tidbits that I borrowed makes them feel authentic, makes them very credible to anybody, especially who's sort of lived in the Valley or worked in tech companies.
Well, I think what you said actually makes a lot of sense there, that there are stories that resonate with people in the Valley. There's truth in all of these stories.
Yeah.
Right, and so it seems like that's one of the things that you also want to convey is there's real truth in the things that happen in the Valley, like fraud and sexual harassment and self-dealing. You know, was it difficult to write about those things? I mean, when you're doing that, right, you're really putting this stuff out there in a way that people have to confront very directly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, I to be clear, you know, there is, you know, fraud and legitimate crimes that take place in this that I never, you know, thank goodness, never witnessed anything like that in my own career. But I've certainly had many, you know, incidents that you just kind of crawl home at the end of the day and you're like, I don't know if I can do this anymore. You know, I've had to lay off, you know, tons of people. I've been laid off myself several times. You know, unfortunately, I was at a company that had, you know, an incident of sexual harassment with an employee within the organization, and that is a bit of a theme in the book too. So yes, this stuff happens, and we've certainly all read headlines where it's really happened and been, you know, really problematic. I mean, and yet we go back to the well. You know, I just saw, is it Adam Newman, the former Weaver? I mean, you're like, are you kidding me? I mean, his yet to be operational company is valued over $1 billion. And this is a guy who, you know, arguably was one of the most self-dealing executives of this era, along with, you know, a lot of other names I could name. So, you know, I think has always been an aspect of Silicon Valley that I truly disdain, is that, you know, if people made people a lot of money, they kind of get unlimited second chances, and there's a lot of turning the other way that can happen, you know, regardless of what that behavior is, and when there's that kind of money at stake too, you know, you can kind of solve any problem, and I think that's really one of the, you know, a big challenge in Silicon Valley is, you know, the byproduct, or one of the byproducts of this industry is just kind of this enormous wealth disparity that it's created, and you know, that's another thing that I think we in the industry need to kind of reckon with.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's a wonderful book. It's a beautiful read. One of the things I really appreciated going through it is that as you're going through, there's lots of things you're taking away from it. You're thinking about your values. You're thinking about the culture in the Valley. You're thinking about your morality. There was even some historical tidbits about the area I didn't know about. I was like, wow, that's interesting. So for me, I took a ton away from the book. What were you hoping that people would take away from the book?
Well, I should mention too, you know, as much as I do describe this as a critique, it's also sort of a love story to Silicon Valley. I mean, I remember coming out of here in '96, I'm like, I am never leaving, you know, like this is paradise. You know, I feature in the book dozens of real world places, from, you know, Cafe Baroni in Menlo Park to the Dutch Goose, also in Menlo Park, to the Four Seasons Hotel over here in Palo Alto. And I had this sort of, you know, cockamamie idea to maybe go out and show people those places. So I've been doing a series of videos on YouTube, none of which is longer than 2 minutes, most are only a minute, so you're not sitting down for a long period of time, but where I go visit those places. I started with this spot, which is up near Twin Peaks, that serves as the background of the book. So check those out on YouTube if you get a chance. What was your question again?
What do you hope people take out?
All right. You know, so I really, I don't want to. It's hard to answer that question without giving away the ending, and I don't want to give away the ending. But each of us, and I think this was something I really recognized for myself, bear a responsibility by being here and being in this industry to do what we can to do the right thing, if you will, in short. And Sam ends up being sort of the CEO of this company. He's in a position of power to be able to do that, but everybody bears some responsibility, right? You and I are going to be speaking at the Product Managers Association. Product managers are like a core constituency within Silicon Valley. They are young, fresh out of MBA usually, and if they are being manipulative with the platform, that's bad, and you're training somebody who's potentially going to become an executive someday. And so, I really hope people's big takeaway from the book is, there aren't good guys and bad guys in this book. We all have a responsibility to do what's right, to again make the world a better place genuinely. And I think that was a little bit, again, the personal journey I went on of like, okay, what do I want to be doing with my life? What do I want to be doing with my career? And I hope that it affords people a chance to kind of review and ask themselves that question, whatever your situation might be. So.
Well, I want to be mindful of time, but I got one more question before we open it up to some audience
Get your questions ready.
So get them ready.
The first question is always the awkward one.
Yeah. So think of a good one. Sure you will. People describe the process of writing a book like giving birth, but perhaps less painful in that kind of way. And then right after someone has a baby, other than the how are you doing, are you getting sleep, the next question people ask are, you thinking about having another one? So what are you working on now? Is there a next novel for you?
There is. There's a little teaser description of it, back cover right up on my website. The working title is Burner, as in a burner phone, but also it's the anonymous alter ego of the main character. So there's an anonymous agitator, kind of a populist agitator online named Burner 911. Nobody knows who he really is. And so in the opening scene, Shane, the protagonist, has just been arrested and accused of terrorism. And so the whole book sort of unspools from there of, okay, how do you get into jail? The backstory on him, and his secret relationship with the daughter of a internet billionaire. So there's a lot in it. It's a little more of a thriller. I guess I don't like genre labels, but it's a little bit more in the thriller genre, and it's very fast paced. It's I don't think any chapter is more than about 1,000 words. So you fly through it. There's dual narration, first person from both Shane and Chloe, the female protagonist in the book, and it's a blast. It's been a blast to write. A few people in this room have gotten like advanced like first draft copies of serving as beta readers. So that's been wonderful. For me, there's sort of three parts to bringing a book to market. There's the writing it, there's the editing it, and there's the promoting it. For me, writing it is super fun because that's like the most raw creative part of the process, and it really exercises my creative brain. I also like promoting it. I spent most of my career in marketing, and so that comes very natural to me. The editing it is just, because everything you wrote, of course, you're like, this is brilliant. Why would I ever change this? But it's also 500 pages. So it's incredibly valuable for me to kind of do what I'm doing right now with that book, which is step back, have other people read it, tell me where they got bored, where they lost interest, what they found compelling, etc., and then I'll sort of go from there. So that'll probably, at the speed of the publishing industry, that'll probably come out in about, I'm hoping 2023, but it's probably be early 2024.
Right on. Well, so everyone should get a copy of BitFlip and read it quickly so you can be prepared for me.
Yeah, exactly.
So we want to open it up also to questions from the audience.
Yes. Okay, speaking of the good guys and the bad guys, I haven't heard you talk about the VCs.
The VCs, yes, there are, I don't know if anybody heard the question, good guys and bad guys, and what about the VCs? So, Sam's company, which is called Inetu, there are 3 venture capital investors in the organization. And they are, they each play sort of very different roles, even though they're all VCs, and different personalities to a large extent too. I have a lot of friends who are VCs, and so and VCs kind of are like probably surpassing lawyers in terms of like the most vilified profession. I think a lot of VCs are wonderful people, I should caveat, but I also think that a lot of entrepreneurs don't understand, especially young entrepreneurs. I did not understand this early in my career, what it means to take venture capital. It dramatically changes what you're doing. You're no longer in business for yourself, essentially, is the big thing that happens. Unless you're, fortunate enough to be Mark Zuckerberg, where you can dictate terms, you kind of lose control at that point. And venture investors, by the nature of their asset class, have, very specific, they have their investors that they need to answer to. They need to exit their companies within defined time horizons, or they won't get their rate of return that they need to justify it. So I think, like similarly within people who are within companies operating, for investors who invest in companies, I do think there are some negative aspects just of the structure of that and the incentives that creates for everybody involved. Some of the sentiments that those venture investors express, are sentiments I've heard in my career, and it sort of can take you back a little bit. And back to your point about takeaways, that was something I also wanted to, take the bloom off the rose a little bit. I think that, again, younger people early in the career, I was so starry-eyed about starting companies, and it's not all it's chalked up to be. So I wanted to sort of impart some of those learnings over my 25-year career to maybe somebody who's earlier in their career, so that they kind of come into the industry a little bit more eyes wide open. Sorry, I'm talking to you, but the answer is to you. Yes, Anne.
So, what's the day like for you in terms of writing? I mean, you're not working at this point in terms
I'm
of
not.
writing the
Thank God, Leslie has a paycheck, which keeps me. No, it's been, it sort of was a very natural extension of COVID stay at home. I still am staying at home, even though I'm a very social person, and sometimes I'm climbing up the walls. I don't have I'm in a weird stage with the second book right now, in that it's written, and I'm at the stage where I deliberately don't want to look at it, right? Like, I was kind of grinding it and editing it and rewriting sections for 6 months, and I was like, all right, I gotta get this out in the world, get feedback, and then I can iterate on it. So right now, I'm not doing anything on the new book, and I'm spending a ton of time promoting this book. So I'm in sort of an unusual window. I usually try to write, pretty regularly every day, although I confess, maybe this is the OCD in me, that I'll have sort of bursts of productivity, and I kind of let myself ride those waves. If I get a spurt of inspiration at 11 o'clock at night, I'll go, and I can be very productive, sometimes at unusual times. So I don't stick to a super rigid schedule, and it's so far it's generally worked. So.
Well, thank you. It was a fun book to read.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, congrats.
Thank you.
Yeah, great job. And this is sort of a follow-on question, which is now, and maybe this is too early for you, but do you now consider your career? Are you a writer now, or do you envision ever going back into tech, or maybe you're taking it one book at a time at this point?
Yes, I'd say I consider myself a writer now.
Yeah.
Like, when people ask me at a cocktail party, like, what do you do? I sort of have gotten comfortable saying I'm an author, more so now that the book is actually out. People, I'm an author. Oh, great, can I read your stuff? Well, it's not out for another 6 months. That was a hard place to be. I really do enjoy it. You know, again, the kind of the only part I don't enjoy is a little bit of the lack of the, you know, what I loved about tech companies and my career is the camaraderie. Like, you know, there's so many people that have, you know, I'll be lifelong friends with that I work with. It's such a key social network, you know, especially out here in the Bay Area, and so I miss that element, but I enjoy doing it. I feel like for me too, I you know, people ask, how do you get writer's block? I was like, you know, not so much. Like I do feel like I've got ideas for, I got a third novel that I'm sort of in outlining stage on. I have a fourth that, you know, is sort of just a scrap of notes right now, but yeah, I definitely will do a second novel.
Yeah.
I expect to do a third novel, and you know, I mean, if I'm doing this for a decade and, you know, I've sold 18 books, you know, I'll probably say maybe something else would be better for me. But, yeah.
Why did you choose Sam as your protagonist? Like, did you shape him in a certain way so he could be the ideal vessel for the story? What do you want to say?
You know, I think that was probably, I don't know if I probably already did the question, how did I shape Sam as the protagonist? You know, you hear the advice so much, it's almost a cliche to sort of write what you know. I think as a first-time writer, you know, you don't have to like get into somebody else's head, and I think there's a certain sensitivity to that too, right? You know, you want to tell a story that you can sort of authentically tell because you've lived some of those experiences. I was at a great writing workshop over the summer when one of the whole panels was writing as other genders. So, you know, if you're a male author, you're writing as a female narrator, and vice versa. And I've started to do that with my second book. So my second book has first person narration. So this is also different for me because Bidflip is third person. And I'm writing both from a male voice and a female voice. So that's been sort of a fun, interesting challenge because I have to sort of imagine, you know, what you got to get into character, kind of, right? It's like almost like acting a role. So I think the honest answer to your question is, you know, with the first book, it felt a little bit more comfortable to me, a little easier perhaps even to write in as a character who's kind of close to me. But now I'm getting, you know, the creative juices are going a little bit more, and I think I'll probably cast further in future books. There's another hand somewhere in this zip code. No? Anyone? How are we doing?
And I can ask a question kind of building on that, which is like, what advice would you have for people who are aspiring authors, maybe even younger people? What can they start to learn, experience, that will help set them up to write their first book?
That's a great question. So what advice to aspiring authors? So, you know, I don't want to sound glib, but writing is really a challenging career, right? I mean, and yet it is going through a transformation and has been. You know, you talk to anybody who's a long-time publishing industry, they're just like, oh my God, like it's so different, it's changed so much. And, you know, me being new in the publishing industry, I kind of didn't know any better, right? I mean, for me, it was sort of like, I see some of those changes, especially for somebody who's, you know, relatively tech savvy, as opportunities, right? Like and so I think for aspiring writers, especially younger writers, they can get to market in ways that just weren't possible before, right? They can build an audience in ways that weren't possible before. You know, you see kids who are full-blown influencers, right? They have massive followings on TikTok or Instagram or other platforms. You know, that's a mixed bag, as we talked about earlier, but it can also give you a voice, it can give you a platform. I think the other bit of advice I'd share, and I did do, there's a video on my website, I was asked for 5 tips for becoming a successful author, which I was like, well, I'm not quite a successful author, let's just get to author for now. But, you know, it's to just kind of keep writing, right? Like, there's, you know, the body of work that you produce is sort of ultimately how you'll get discovered, how your career will be defined. And so I try to, I'm an avid writer in ways besides books. For folks who are on my blog, I write, a couple articles a month on various topics that are just of interest to me. So write, contribute to stuff, build your platform, don't be afraid, be authentic to your voice, and don't be afraid to bring a unique perspective. I think that's another thing that, especially a young writer, it's very easy when you're young and you're a little insecure and you're a little uncertain, like, oh, I don't know if I want to write about that because it might be boring. Or it could be like super, super interesting. I'm reading a great novel right now called Night Crawling, which I'm sure is for sale here, about an African-American woman growing up in Oakland, and like, her experiences, like, that's why you read, right? You read to live somebody, be in somebody else's shoes for a minute, and just getting those stories out there, you'll find your audience. Yeah.
Any plans for writing a screenplay?
Oh gosh, do you know anybody at Netflix? I'd love to. This was another thing that came up in this writers conference that I was at, where a lot of thriller books, and that was the whole focus of the conference, get turned into screenplays. And a lot of the authors, almost every author there who'd had a book turned into a screenplay, had mixed feelings about it, I'll say, right? Talk about losing control of your work, right? I mean, they really do. But I'm a visual person. I mentioned I'm shooting these videos around the Bay Area. I think there's, I could imagine what the movie of BitFlip might look like in my head to some degree. So I think there's enough that sort of happens out and about that it could make for an interesting.
You get to choose
What are
the
they,
actors.
movies? Well, oftentimes not. A good friend of mine,
And hang
she
out
wrote
with
a
them.
great screenplay. She's like, they were off and running. They kind of take it and they go. We'll see. Yeah.
How do you stay motivated halfway through writing a novel? Because I feel like it'd be easy to lose momentum.
It is very easy to lose momentum. So, I mentioned, I sort of was complaining about the editing stage. I think for me, like, I love that, like, first draft, right? It's just like, I see the story, it's gonna be so great. And like, you just kind of, you're typing a mile a minute to get it all down there. And then you go back and you're like, oh, wow, this was great. Maybe that 2 a.m. writing binge wasn't all that I thought it was. And so, that's probably, I don't really, writer's block for me isn't quite the right word. It's like editor's block. I sometimes have a hard time kind of going back and saying, okay, how am I going to change this? And then what kind of the dirty little secret that no novelist tells you is that, a novel is it's just a lot of content, right? I mean, you can kind of, even as the author, lose track of like, wait, where did I talk about this in this section, and did I write this? And so as you start to change things, it's like the Rubik's Cube. You're like, oh crap, now this part doesn't make any sense anymore, So you really have to be, that's where you have to really sort of button down. It's a lot of hours. It feels like it should be easy and fast to do, but it's really hard to do. And you just, how do you avoid it? I just sort of, I try to give myself milestones sometimes. I'll say like, all right, I'm gonna finish this by the end of the month, like this chapter that I'm editing or whatever it is, because it's easy to have kind of approach avoidance and just shelve it and be like, yeah, that's good enough. So you gotta just break through those things. Yeah.
Hey Mike, congratulations.
Thank you.
First of all.
Yeah.
Did you have a character that you particularly loved to write? Like whenever this person would show up, you're like, oh, I'd love to fill out the vibe of this character. Just curious.
I referenced him earlier. I think Peter Green was a pretty fun character to write. So he's this billionaire in the story, and what's the right word for him? Eccentric, reclusive is probably maybe a better word. He's kind of cloistered in his giant mansion with his staff, and never leaves his home, and has a security detail that goes with him everywhere. And he kind of becomes the voice in Sam's ear of like, you gotta go for it, you can't fall off the horse, like you gotta make this go, etc. And he's kind of this Midas touch guy, everything that he's done has been a huge success. And so that was a fun character to write because he sort of presents the allure of, again, I won't pretend that wasn't an appealing part of coming to Silicon Valley for me, right? It's like, hey, I can do a startup and it could have an IPO or get acquired and all these great things can happen. That's definitely a motivator. And so he's kind of the devil on the one shoulder for Sam. So he was a fun one to write. And a lot of his scenes and situations. There's a scene where Sam visits him at his home. Was fun to write as well. Yeah.
Mike, super proud of you.
Thank you.
For this journey you've gone.
Thank you.
Other than buy a couple copies of
Awesome.
the book.
Love it.
Tell friends about it. What can we do to help you promote this?
Oh gosh, Keith, I love that up. You're logging out to me. There's this interesting thing that happened. I mean, it's been so gratifying. I appreciate the support of all of you so tremendously. But again, I'm sort of a marketer, so you can only build so much momentum with your first degree of separation, people right? For this novel really to grow, it's kind of got to jump those social circles out to bigger and bigger audiences.
Yeah.
And so a lot of things that I produce on social media and my writing and everything else is really to try and give mechanisms for that to happen, right? Besides just buying the book, to give people a chance to share it on your social or talk to a friend about it or subscribe to my YouTube channel or whatever it might be. So those things are super helpful. Ultimately, this industry is a word of mouth industry, and we in Silicon Valley in general don't talk about books as much as maybe we should. But whenever somebody says to me like, "Oh, you should check that book out," I usually check that book out. So tell people about it is the short answer. And tell people that I don't already know. That's because the ones I know are sick of hearing about it. Yeah, your book.
Well, maybe in the interest of time, we might want to wrap it up here. First, I want to thank you for writing a tremendous book. It's really a wonderful read, and for an engaging conversation. Thanks for going into so much detail about the book. Wonderful.
And thank you, Mehran, for being here.
We wanted to thank the Books Inc. staff, especially Alex, for helping put this event together and for having, I think one of the things that Books Inc. does that's really nice, it's a reflection of the community. It brings people together to be able to talk about things that are important to them, gets us pulled away from computer screens for a little while so we can actually interact with friends, family, and other members of the community, which I think is just a lovely thing. And thanks to all of you for coming tonight, for spending some of your time with us. Take care of each other, take care of yourselves, and take care of the community that we're all part of. So thanks again, Mike. And if people want to buy copies of the book
if anybody wants
and want to get it signed, the protocol is you should purchase your book and then make a line down the middle, and Mike will be here signing. Thanks very much.
Also, bring us pro practice.